The stale bread crumbled in Hans Schmidt's hands as he carefully divided his daily ration, 300 grams that needed to sustain him through another grueling day on the Eastern Front. 2,000 miles away, in Camp Algona, Iowa, German prisoner of war Fritz Weber finished his hearty breakfast of eggs, bacon, and fresh toast before boarding a truck that would take him to harvest corn on a nearby American farm. His payment, 80 cents a day in canteen coupons, enough to buy cigarettes, snacks, and even beer. These two German soldiers, fighting for the same cause but separated by capture, experienced two radically different versions of the war, one defined by increasing desperation and hunger, the other by relative comfort and productive labor. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. By 1944, the Third Reich's ambitious conquest had begun its inevitable collapse. As Allied forces pushed from west and Soviet armies advanced from the east, Hitler's war machine faced a catastrophic reality. Germany could no longer feed its own armies. The once fearsome Wehrmacht, which had marched confidently across Europe just years earlier, now struggled with basic sustenance. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States faced an entirely different problem, with millions of American men serving overseas who would harvest the abundant crops of America's heartland. The solution came in an unexpected form: German prisoners of war. Between 1942 and 1946, America would house over 425,000 enemy POWs, primarily Germans, in nearly 700 camps spread across 46 states. Far from the brutal concentration camps of Nazi Germany or the deadly Siberian gulags of the Soviet Union, these American POW camps became sites of an unprecedented social experiment, the productive employment of captured enemy soldiers on American soil. The contrast could not have been more stark. As German field commanders sent increasingly desperate communications to Berlin about troops subsisting on inadequate rations, sometimes as little as 1,500 calories per day, captured German soldiers in America were receiving the same daily caloric intake as U.S. Army personnel, approximately 3,000 calories. While malnutrition weakened German fighting forces in Europe, German POWs in America gained weight. The seeds of this remarkable disparity were planted long before the first shots of World War II were fired. Germany, with limited agricultural land and a dense population, had never achieved food self-sufficiency. The traumatic food shortages of the turnip winter during World War I, when thousands of German civilians starved due to the British naval blockade, haunted the national consciousness. Hitler's regime had promised this would never happen again, but by 1942, the Reich faced the same fundamental problem: how to feed a nation at war when its agricultural capacity couldn't match its imperial ambitions. America, by contrast, entered the war with unprecedented agricultural abundance. The Great Plains alone produced more wheat than most European countries combined. Iowa's corn yields reached record levels. California's valleys overflowed with fruits and vegetables. This abundance became both strategic advantage and logistical challenge. How to harvest it all with a depleted workforce? The answer came on September 12, 1942, when the first significant group of German POWs arrived on American soil. Initially housed at Camp Concordia in Kansas, these prisoners, many captured during the North African campaign, found themselves in a strange, new world. Their captors, bound by the Geneva Convention of 1929, provided clean quarters, adequate food, and medical care. But it was the introduction of paid labor that would transform the POW experience in America into something unique in military history. We expected to be treated harshly, remembered former POW Gunther Oswald in a 1978 interview. We had been told Americans would mistreat us. Instead, we found ourselves living better than we had in our army. And then they asked if we wanted to work for pay. It seemed unbelievable. The War Department initially approached the POW labor program cautiously. Early work assignments were limited to tasks on military bases, kitchen duty, grounds maintenance, laundry service. But as labor shortages in the agricultural sector reached crisis levels in 1943, the program expanded rapidly. POWs soon found themselves picking cotton in Arizona, harvesting sugar beets in Colorado, cutting timber in Oregon, and detasseling corn in the Midwest. Camp Algona in Iowa became one of the largest and most successful POW operations. Established in 1943, the main camp and its 34 smaller branch camps would eventually house nearly 10,000 German prisoners. Their impact on Iowa's agricultural production was immediate and substantial. In the summer of 1944 alone, Algona POWs harvested over 2.5 million bushels of corn and processed millions of pounds of peas, beans, and other vegetables in local canneries. The program expanded with remarkable speed. By 1944, POW labor had become essential to American food production. The War Food Administration reported that in many agricultural regions, German prisoners constituted up to 30% of the seasonal workforce. That year, POWs worked approximately 20 million man-days, generating the equivalent of $80 million, over $1.2 billion in today's currency, in labor value for the American economy. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the situation for German forces grew increasingly dire. The Reich's ambitious plans for agricultural self-sufficiency through the conquest of Ukraine's fertile lands had failed spectacularly. Soviet scorched earth tactics, combined with fierce resistance, meant that the expected food supplies never materialized. By late 1944, ration cuts had become routine. Field Marshal Walter Model's situation report to Hitler's headquarters in November 1944 painted a grim picture. Soldiers of the 7th Army have been on reduced rations for 17 consecutive days. Combat effectiveness is severely compromised. Men report dizziness and fatigue during basic maneuvers. We cannot sustain offensive operations without immediate improvement in supply situation. No improvement came. As Allied bombing intensified, Germany's transportation network collapsed. Food shipments that did exist often couldn't reach frontline units. The once mighty Wehrmacht was literally starving, with daily rations in some units falling below 1,200 calories, less than half what their captured comrades received daily in America. The diverging experiences of German soldiers reflected a fundamental contrast in national approaches to food security. Germany had gambled its food future on conquest, believing that the subjugation of Eastern Europe would provide the agricultural bounty needed to sustain the Reich. America, meanwhile, had invested in domestic agricultural production, creating the most efficient farming system in world history. This contrast manifested in the physical conditions of the soldiers themselves. Medical examinations of newly captured German prisoners in 1944-45 frequently noted signs of malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies, dental problems, reduced muscle mass. After several months in American custody, these same men typically showed significant health improvements. When I arrived at Camp Hearn in Texas, recalled former Wehrmacht soldier Klaus Becker, I weighed 142 pounds, down from my normal 170. 6 months later, I was back to my regular weight. The food was simple but plentiful, more meat than I had seen in years. The American POW labor program was not without controversy. Some Americans objected to what they perceived as coddling the enemy. Editorial cartoons depicted fat, happy German prisoners enjoying American abundance while U.S. soldiers fought and died overseas. Senator Alexander Wiley of Wisconsin voiced a common concern when he complained that POWs were being treated to a good old American vacation. These criticisms missed the pragmatic core of the program. POW labor was not charity, but necessity, a creative solution to critical wartime labor shortages. Furthermore, The program strictly adhered to Geneva Convention requirements, which prohibited forcing POWs to work in dangerous conditions or in direct support of war efforts against their home country. The War Department established clear guidelines. Prisoners would work only in non-war-related industries, would receive pay equal to the going rate for civilian workers, with most wages held in credit until after the war, would not displace American workers, and would enjoy the same safety protections as civilian employees. Far from a vacation, the program represented a pragmatic balance between humane treatment and national necessity. Camp life followed a structured routine. Prisoners typically rose at 5:30 a.m. for roll call, followed by breakfast at 6 a.m. Work details departed by 7 a.m. and returned by 6 p.m., with a lunch break at midday. Evenings were free time, and many camps developed rich cultural activities, orchestras, theater groups, educational classes, and sports teams. The living conditions, while basic, exceeded what many prisoners had experienced in their own military. Barracks were heated in winter and screened against insects in summer. Medical care was equivalent to that provided to American troops. Food was simple but nutritious and abundant. A typical day's meals might include cereal and eggs for breakfast, soup and sandwiches for lunch, and meat with vegetables for dinner. This abundance stood in stark contrast to conditions in Germany, where by 1944 even civilians in Berlin received severely restricted rations. A typical German civilian's weekly allotment included just 275 grams of meat, 50 grams of cheese, and 1/800 grams of bread. German soldiers on the front lines received preferential rations when available, but logistical failures meant these priorities often existed only on paper. The difference extended beyond mere calories. American POW camps provided a level of food variety that had disappeared from German military and civilian life. Fresh fruits and vegetables, dairy products, and regular meat portions had become rare luxuries in the Reich by mid-war. In American camps, these were standard fare. As German POWs harvested America's bounty, their compatriots at home and on the front lines increasingly relied on ersatz foods, coffee made from roasted barley, margarine instead of butter, and bread extended with sawdust and other fillers. The Reich's Ministry of Food and Agriculture continuously developed new substitute foods as shortages worsened, creating increasingly unpalatable options that provided calories but little satisfaction or complete nutrition. Historian Lizzie Collingham notes in her comprehensive study, The Taste of War, that by late 1944, the average German soldier received a diet nutritionally inferior to that provided to American household pets. Meanwhile, German POWs in America ate according to the same nutritional guidelines developed for U.S. Army personnel. The extensive use of POW labor transformed both the American wartime economy and the prisoners themselves. Many German POWs came from urban backgrounds and had never worked on farms before their American captivity. They learned new skills and gained unexpected insights into American society through their work placements. Farmer John Miller from Wellman, Iowa, who employed 6 German POWs during the 1944 harvest season, later recalled, "They were just young men, not so different from our own boys who were away fighting. They worked hard, learned quick, and seemed grateful to be treated decently. By the end of harvest, my wife was packing them extra desserts in their lunch pails." These human connections formed despite language barriers and the official enemy status of the prisoners. Many farmers reported developing unexpectedly positive relationships with their German workers. POW Hans Rice, who worked on a Minnesota farm, described the transformation. "At first, the farmer watched me suspiciously, as if I might attack him with a pitchfork. By the end of summer, he was teaching me to drive his tractor and invited me to dinner with his family. I had to remind myself we were supposed to be enemies." Such experiences directly contradicted Nazi propaganda, which had portrayed Americans as culturally inferior and morally decadent. Many prisoners noted in diaries and letters their surprise at the prosperity of ordinary American farms. indoor plumbing, electrical appliances, and mechanized equipment that far exceeded the standard of living they had known in Germany. Otto Zamy, who worked in Iowa cornfields, wrote in his journal, "The abundance here seems almost obscene compared to conditions at home. The farmers' children leave food on their plates that would feed a German family for days. Their dog eats meat daily. I have not seen such plenty since before the war." This prosperity made a profound impression. A censored letter from a POW in Arkansas to his family in Germany stated, "Everything they told us about America was a lie. There is no poverty here. Even the smallest farm has more machinery than our largest estates. Every family has an automobile. The war has not touched these people as it has touched us." The American authorities recognized the potential propaganda value of these observations. The War Department's Prisoner of War Special Projects Division developed a re-education program aimed at exposing German prisoners to democratic ideas and American values. While participation remained voluntary to comply with Geneva Convention prohibitions against forced indoctrination, the program attracted significant interest among prisoners. By late 1944, as Germany's military situation deteriorated, attitudes among many POWs shifted. Those who had been captured early in the war, often the most dedicated Nazis, found themselves increasingly isolated as newer arrivals brought news of Germany's collapsing position. Camp authorities noted a decline in Nazi salutes and other displays of regime loyalty. This shift was accelerated by the revelation of Nazi atrocities as Allied forces liberated concentration camps in 1945. American authorities made sure this news reached the POW population, showing newsreels and distributing publications documenting the Holocaust. For many prisoners, these revelations prompted profound soul-searching. Carl Schmidt, held at Camp Crossville in Tennessee, described his reaction. "When they showed us the films of Buchenwald, many men wept. Some claimed it was propaganda, but most of us knew it was true. In that moment, I felt shame to have worn the same uniform as those who did such things." While German soldiers in America experienced this moral reckoning in relative comfort, their comrades in Europe faced an increasingly desperate situation. By early 1945, the Wehrmacht's supply system had effectively collapsed. Units fought not just against Allied forces, but against starvation. An intelligence report captured from the German 352nd Infantry Division in February 1945 stated, "Men have been consuming local wildlife, including rats and birds. Cases of soldiers stealing food from civilian homes have increased despite severe punishments. Medical officers report widespread dysentery and vitamin deficiency disorders. Combat readiness is at critical levels." Hitler's response to the crisis reflected his growing detachment from reality. In a December 1944 directive, he ordered, "All available food resources must prioritize fighting units. Civilian rations will be further reduced as necessary. Germany will triumph through the will of its soldiers, not through material abundance." This triumph of will philosophy found little traction among hungry troops. Desertion rates skyrocketed in the war's final months. Many soldiers surrendered specifically in hopes of securing adequate food. American intelligence officers reported that captured Germans frequently asked about meals before any other aspect of their captivity. Lieutenant James Morrison, who processed German prisoners in France in 1945, noted, "Their first question was almost always about food, when they would eat, how much they would get." Many seemed more relieved about regular meals than about escaping combat. They were literally starving in their foxholes. The contrast between German soldiers starving in Europe and German POWs helping harvest America's abundance represented more than just the fortunes of war. It illuminated fundamental differences between the economic and agricultural systems of the two nations and between their approaches to international law and human dignity. Germany had built its war machine on a foundation of conquest, plunder, and exploitation. Its plans for feeding its population and military relied on seizing resources from conquered territories and extracting forced labor from subjugated populations. When this strategy failed, there was no backup plan. The system collapsed, and German soldiers paid with their health and lives. America, despite the enormous demands of global war, maintained both agricultural productivity and commitment to international law regarding prisoner treatment. This dual success stemmed not from moral superiority alone, but from the pragmatic recognition that well-treated prisoners could contribute productively to the war economy. As the European conflict entered its final months, the divergent experiences of German soldiers came into even sharper contrast. In March 1945, as American forces crossed the Rhine, they encountered Wehrmacht units existing on less than 1,000 calories daily. Medical examinations of captured soldiers showed that over 60% suffered from malnutrition. During this same period, German POWs in America were preparing for spring planting. At Camp Clarinda in Iowa, prisoners cultivated a 10-acre vegetable garden that would supplement the camp's already adequate food supply. At Fort Robinson in Nebraska, German POWs worked in a meat processing facility that shipped thousands of tons of beef to American troops and allies overseas, beef that would never reach German soldiers. The physical manifestation of these different circumstances became starkly visible as the war concluded. American war correspondent Martha Gellhorn, entering Germany with advancing Allied forces, described the condition of surrendering Wehrmacht troops. They were gaunt men with hollow eyes and protruding ribs. Their uniforms hung on them as if designed for larger soldiers. They fell upon food packages with an animal desperation that was difficult to watch. Meanwhile, American newspaper photographer Walter Dane visited Camp Algona in Iowa and captured images of robust, healthy-looking German prisoners playing soccer on well-maintained fields. His editor ultimately declined to publish most of these photos, concerned they would anger readers with family members fighting overseas. As Germany hurtled toward final defeat in April 1945, Hitler issued his infamous Nero Decree, ordering the destruction of all infrastructure and resources to prevent their use by advancing Allied forces. This scorched earth policy included food supplies. In several instances, SS units destroyed food warehouses rather than allow their contents to feed either German civilians or advancing Allied troops. This final act of nihilism stood in stark contrast to the constructive labor of German POWs in America, who that same month were planting crops that would feed both Americans and, through aid programs, many Europeans, including Germans, after the war. The two approaches represented opposing visions of humanity's relationship with itself and with the natural world, one destructive and ultimately self-defeating, the other productive despite the context of global conflict. As Germany collapsed in May 1945, the contrast became visible even to the German population. American forces entering German territory often brought mobile field kitchens that provided hot meals to civilian populations. German refugees, streaming westward to escape advancing Soviet forces, frequently remarked on the abundance of food in American-controlled areas compared to the scarcity they had experienced under Nazi rule. With Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945, the fate of POWs in America entered a new phase. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners should have been promptly repatriated after hostilities ceased. However, the massive destruction of European infrastructure, combined with urgent rebuilding needs, complicated this process. Most German POWs would remain in American custody for months or even years after the war's end, continuing their agricultural work. This extended captivity provoked complex emotions among the prisoners. Many had received news of destroyed homes, displaced families, and the chaotic conditions in post-war Germany. For some, remaining in the relative comfort and stability of American camps seemed preferable to immediate return to a shattered homeland. "I learned my family's home in Dresden had been destroyed," recalled former POW Manfred Schneider. "My parents were refugees somewhere in the Western Zone. What was I rushing home to? At least in Iowa, I had shelter, food, and work. It sounds strange, but I almost feared repatriation. This sentiment was not uncommon. A State Department survey of German POWs in late 1945 found that nearly 30% expressed reluctance about immediate repatriation, citing concerns about conditions in occupied Germany. The American authorities faced an unexpected situation. Some enemy prisoners preferred to remain in captivity. The War Department developed a priority system for repatriation, with dedicated Nazis and security risks sent home first, while those deemed potentially valuable for reconstruction efforts or who had specialized agricultural skills were often retained longer. This system also considered the prisoner's own preferences when possible, though the Geneva Convention ultimately required all to be repatriated. Between 1945 and 1946, German POWs continued to play a crucial role in American agriculture. The end of the war had not immediately solved the labor shortage, as demobilization of American troops occurred gradually. The 1945 harvest season saw nearly as many German prisoners working American fields as had the previous year. Their contribution during this period was substantial. Iowa's agricultural output in 1945 exceeded pre-war levels by 38%, despite significant labor shortages. German POW workers were credited with preventing what could have been a dramatic post-war drop in production. Similar patterns appeared across the agricultural states. The irony was profound. Former enemy soldiers were helping feed not only America, but, through growing foreign aid programs, much of Europe, including the devastated German homeland. As part of the emerging Marshall Plan, American agricultural products became a lifeline for starving European populations, German civilians among them. In Frankfurt, Germany, in November 1945, former Wehrmacht soldier Peter Krauss stood in line for American food aid. "They gave us white bread, real coffee, and tins of meat," he later wrote. "The woman ahead of me began to cry when she saw the food. She said her children had never tasted white bread before. I had not seen such food since before the war, except during my time as a prisoner in America." As repatriation accelerated in 1946, many German POWs found themselves facing a difficult transition. They returned to a homeland physically and psychologically devastated, where food rationing remained more severe than what they had experienced in American camps. In the Soviet occupation zone, returning POWs often faced suspicion and sometimes imprisonment. Even in the Western zones, they encountered resentment from civilians who had endured bombing and invasion, while the prisoners enjoyed relative safety in America. Yet many also brought back valuable skills and unexpected perspectives. Those who had worked on American farms returned with knowledge of advanced agricultural techniques, mechanical skills, and ideas about farm management that would contribute to Germany's eventual economic miracle of the 1950s. Former POW and agricultural worker Werner Hoppe established a farm equipment business in Bavaria after his return, importing American designs and eventually manufacturing similar machinery. "What I learned about American farming methods changed my entire understanding of agriculture," he stated in a 1952 interview. "I saw how much more could be produced with the right approach and equipment." This knowledge was perhaps the only positive thing I brought back from the war. The POW labor program left lasting marks on American agriculture as well. Farmers who had employed German prisoners gained experience with different agricultural traditions and sometimes adopted techniques suggested by their temporary workers. Several Midwestern farming communities reported incorporating European crop rotation methods or planting techniques introduced by POWs. Harold Jensen, an Iowa farmer who employed 8 German prisoners during 1944-45, later installed a modified irrigation system based on a design suggested by a prisoner who had farmed in northern Germany. He sketched it out for me, showing how they managed similar soil conditions back home, Jensen recalled. "I was skeptical, but it worked better than what we had been doing. Good ideas don't care which uniform you wear." Such cultural exchanges extended beyond agricultural techniques. In many communities, especially in the Midwest where Germanic cultural heritage was already strong, the presence of German POWs catalyzed renewed interest in German language, music, and traditions, elements that had been suppressed during the war years due to anti-German sentiment. In New Ulm, Minnesota, a town with strong German roots, local citizens cautiously renewed cultural connections through interactions with POWs from the nearby camp. The camp commander permitted prisoners with musical training to perform German folk songs at a community event in fall 1945, the first public performance of German music in the town since 1941. The event drew a large, emotional crowd, including many German Americans who had hidden their cultural identity during the war years. This cultural impact was not limited to communities with German heritage. In many rural areas with POW camps, the prisoners represented local residents' first direct exposure to people from another country. The humanizing effect of these encounters helped counter wartime propaganda and stereotypes on both sides. Mildred Schaefer of Clarinda, Iowa, reflected on this impact. Before the Germans came to the camp here, they were just the faceless enemy to us. Afterward, they became Karl and Hans and Friedrich, young men not so different from our own sons. It changed how many of us thought about the war and about people from other countries generally. The economic impact of the POW labor program was substantial. By the time the last German prisoners departed in 1946, they had contributed an estimated 45 million man-days of labor, worth approximately $180 million, equivalent to over $2.6 billion in current value. This labor had been crucial in maintaining agricultural production during a period of severe workforce depletion. The program also generated significant revenue for the U.S. government. Under Geneva Convention rules, the government collected the bulk of POWs' wages, with prisoners receiving only a small portion in camp scrip. The remainder was held in accounts, theoretically to be paid to prisoners upon repatriation. However, much of this money was ultimately claimed by the U.S. as partial compensation for the cost of housing and feeding the prisoners, creating what amounted to a self-funding labor program. This financial arrangement attracted criticism from some quarters. Labor unions occasionally objected to what they perceived as unfair competition from prisoner labor, though these concerns were largely mitigated by the program's focus on agricultural work facing critical labor shortages. Some argued that the program constituted exploitation despite its compliance with Geneva Convention standards. A more nuanced critique came from those who noted the stark contrast between America's treatment of German POWs and its treatment of Japanese Americans. While German prisoners worked for wages and lived in conditions meeting international standards, American citizens of Japanese descent had been confined to internment camps, their property often confiscated, and their constitutional rights suspended. This uncomfortable juxtaposition revealed the racial dimensions of American wartime policies. German prisoners, racially white and culturally familiar to many Americans, received treatment that scrupulously adhered to international law. Japanese Americans, despite their citizenship, faced policies driven by racial prejudice rather than security concerns. Historian Arnold Kramer observed, "The irony was painful. Enemy soldiers received better treatment than American citizens whose only crime was their ancestry. German POWs could work outside camps, earn wages, and enjoy recreational privileges denied to Japanese American internees." This disparity did not go unnoticed by the prisoners themselves. Karl Heinrich, held at Camp Benton in Indiana, wrote in his diary, "Today I saw in the newspaper pictures of Japanese American camps. I was shocked to realize that these American citizens have fewer privileges than we do as enemy prisoners. It makes no sense, except through the lens of race." As the last German POWs departed American soil in 1946, they left behind physical and cultural legacies. Some camps had developed into substantial complexes with prisoner-built facilities, including chapels, theaters, and sports fields. At Camp Algona, prisoners had constructed an elaborate nativity scene featuring 65 hand-carved figures, which they presented to the community as a parting gift. This artwork still goes on display each Christmas season in Algona, a tangible reminder of the complex relationships formed during the POW era. In the years and decades following their repatriation, many former German POWs maintained connections with the American communities where they had worked. Letters crossed the Atlantic in both directions. Some former prisoners eventually returned to visit as tourists or immigrants. A few even married Americans they had met during their captivity after navigating the complicated legal restrictions on enemy alien marriages. Heinz Fussmann, who had harvested apples in Washington state, returned in 1953 as an immigrant and established his own orchard near where he had worked as a prisoner. "I saw opportunity here that no longer existed in Germany," he explained, "and I already knew the business from my time as a POW. It was strange to return by choice to the place of my captivity, but America had shown me its better face during that time." The lasting impact of the POW labor program extended into international relations. As Cold War tensions developed, West Germany became a crucial ally for the United States against Soviet expansion. The relatively positive treatment of German POWs contributed to the rapid reconciliation between former enemies. Many German officials and citizens of the post-war era had either been American POWs themselves or knew someone who had experienced American captivity firsthand. Konrad Adenauer, the first Chancellor of West Germany, noted in a 1953 speech, "Many of our citizens experienced American values directly through the POW program. They saw democracy in practice, not just in theory." This has contributed significantly to the friendship between our nations today. This geopolitical aspect had not been an explicit goal of the program when it began as a pragmatic solution to wartime labor shortages, yet it became an unexpected diplomatic asset as international alignments shifted in the post-war world. The humane treatment of German POWs, driven primarily by Geneva Convention obligations and economic necessity, yielded long-term strategic benefits for American foreign policy. The contrast with Soviet treatment of German prisoners could not have been more stark. Of approximately 3 million German soldiers captured by Soviet forces, an estimated one-third died in captivity. Many survivors were not released until 1955, a decade after the war's end. These men returned with stories of brutal conditions, forced labor in dangerous mines and factories, inadequate food, and systematic mistreatment. This difference in prisoner treatment became a powerful Cold War narrative. West German citizens could compare the experiences of family members held by Western allies versus those captured by Soviets. These personal testimonies reinforced broader anti-communist messaging and strengthened West Germany's Western alignment. Wolfgang Lehmann, who spent 1944-46 as a POW in Nebraska before returning to what became West Germany, expressed a common sentiment. "After hearing what happened to my cousin in a Soviet camp in Siberia, I thanked God every day that I had been captured by Americans. He returned after 10 years broken in body and spirit. I returned healthy, with new skills, and a different view of our former enemies." The agricultural focus of America's POW labor program created another significant contrast with Soviet approaches. While German prisoners in America primarily worked in food production, contributing to abundance, those in Soviet captivity typically worked in extractive industries like mining or logging, often under harsh and dangerous conditions. The different focus reflected broader differences between the economic systems of the two emerging superpowers. By the early 1950s, former German POWs had integrated back into German society, often bringing their American experiences with them. Some, like Friedrich Meyer, who had worked on dairy farms in Wisconsin, introduced agricultural innovations learned during captivity. Meyer established a cooperative farming model in his Bavarian community, based on American practices he had observed, helping revitalize local agriculture during Reconstruction. Academic studies of the POW labor program began to emerge in the 1970s as archives opened and participants became willing to share their experiences. These studies revealed the program's multifaceted impact: economic, cultural, and diplomatic. They also highlighted the program's uniqueness in military history. Never before had enemy prisoners been so extensively and productively integrated into a nation's civilian economy. The program's success stemmed from its ability to solve multiple problems simultaneously. It addressed critical wartime labor shortages, provided productive activity for prisoners, preventing the morale problems that typically plague POW camps, generated economic value that offset imprisonment costs, and complied with international law regarding prisoner treatment. This multi-benefit approach contrasted sharply with Germany's own handling of POWs and forced laborers during the war. The Nazi regime had captured millions of Soviet soldiers and civilians, but rather than developing a system that derived maximum economic benefit from their labor while maintaining their health and productivity, it implemented policies of neglect and abuse that resulted in massive death rates and reduced work capacity. By war's end, nearly 60% of Soviet POWs in German hands had died from starvation, disease, or mistreatment. Those who survived were typically worked under such harsh conditions that their productivity remained far below potential. This approach reflected the regime's ideological priorities, which ranked racial hierarchies above pragmatic economic considerations, even when this undermined Germany's own war effort. America's different approach did not stem primarily from moral superiority, though ethical considerations and legal obligations under the Geneva Convention played important roles. Rather, it reflected a pragmatic recognition that humane treatment and productive employment served American interests better than alternatives. Well-fed, adequately housed prisoners worked more efficiently, caused fewer security problems, and cost less to maintain than prisoners in poor condition. This pragmatism extended to the program's educational components. The Special Projects Division developed materials designed to expose German prisoners to democratic principles and American culture, hoping to influence post-war German society. Unlike Nazi indoctrination programs, participation remained voluntary, with prisoners free to accept or reject the information presented. Captain Walter Schoenstedt, who helped develop these materials, explained the approach. We believed that exposure to facts and ideas presented without coercion would be more effective than forced indoctrination. Many prisoners were suspicious at first, expecting propaganda similar to what they had experienced in Germany. When they discovered they were free to discuss and even criticize the materials, many became genuinely interested. This educational program produced mixed results. Some prisoners embraced the democratic ideas presented, while others remained committed to Nazi ideology or developed cynical views of all political systems. The program's voluntary nature meant it reached primarily those already open to alternative perspectives. Nevertheless, it represented an early form of what would later be called soft power, the attempt to influence through attraction rather than coercion. By the mid-1950s, with German POWs long repatriated and the war receding into history, the labor program faded from public consciousness in both America and Germany. The camps were dismantled, their buildings often repurposed or scrapped. Agricultural regions that had depended on prisoner labor adjusted to peacetime workforce patterns. The program became a footnote in larger narratives of World War II, yet its legacy persisted in less visible ways. Former prisoners who had learned English during captivity often found employment opportunities in post-war Germany's rebuilding economy, particularly with American companies establishing European operations. Their familiarity with American practices and language made them valuable employees in the emerging transatlantic business community. Herbert Wagner, who had worked at a Heinz food processing facility in Pennsylvania as a POW, became one of the company's first employees when it expanded operations to West Germany in 1948. My experience as a prisoner actually became a job qualification, he noted. I understood American business methods and could communicate with the American managers. What began as captivity led to a 30-year career. Agricultural connections also endured. American farm equipment manufacturers found ready markets in post-war Germany, often facilitated by former POWs familiar with their products. Several German agricultural innovations of the 1950s traced their origins to techniques observed or learned by prisoners during their American captivity. The knowledge transfer worked in both directions, with some American farmers adopting European approaches introduced by their temporary German workers. The human connections formed during the POW labor program created lasting personal legacies. By the 1970s, with Cold War tensions still high but diplomatic relations normalized, former German POWs began organizing reunions and return visits to the American communities where they had been held. These visits often became emotional occasions for reconciliation and reflection. In 1975, a group of 25 former prisoners returned to Camp Algona, Iowa, for a reunion with local farmers who had employed them. The event attracted national media attention as former enemies embraced as friends. Werner Lutz, who had harvested corn on Harold Peterson's farm in 1944, presented Peterson with a hand-carved clock he had made in Germany, a tangible symbol of how time had transformed their relationship from captor and captive to something resembling friendship. "I came to say thank you," Lutz told reporters. "I was treated with dignity when I expected cruelty. This changed how I saw Americans, how I saw the world. I wanted Mr. Peterson to know that his kindness mattered, even to an enemy." These reunions revealed how the program had created unexpected spaces for human connection across the divide of war. Despite the context of global conflict, the daily interactions between prisoners and civilians had often transcended political and military enmities. Farmers and prisoners had worked side by side, conversed despite language barriers, and gradually recognized each other's humanity. The contrast with other wartime experiences remained stark. Former Wehrmacht soldier Karl Becker, who had been captured on the Eastern Front before being transferred to American custody, reflected on this difference during a 1978 interview. "On the Russian front, we starved and froze. Prisoners on both sides were treated as less than human. In America, I harvested more food in a season than I had seen in years in the Army. Which approach makes more sense, even in war? The answer seems obvious now." This recognition extended beyond individual experiences to broader questions about national approaches to conflict and resources. The American system had maintained agricultural abundance throughout the war and had pragmatically employed enemy prisoners in productive labor, choices that yielded both immediate benefits and long-term advantages. Germany's system of conquest, exploitation, and ideological rigidity had ultimately failed to feed even its own armies. The lessons were not lost on post-war German leaders. As West Germany rebuilt under the Marshall Plan, it adopted agricultural policies emphasizing efficiency, mechanization, and sustainable productivity rather than territorial expansion. Many of these approaches reflected American models that former POWs had observed firsthand. Economic historian Richard Tilley noted this influence in a 1982 study. The transfer of agricultural knowledge through the POW program represents an underappreciated aspect of post-war reconstruction. Former prisoners who had worked on American farms returned with ideas about mechanization, crop rotation, and farm management that contributed significantly to West Germany's agricultural modernization. The program's impact extended to American agricultural communities as well. In regions that had employed large numbers of German POWs, the experience often challenged preconceived notions about the enemy. Farmers who had initially regarded the prisoners with suspicion frequently developed more nuanced views through daily interaction. Martha Knudsen, whose family farm near Algona employed 8 prisoners during 1944-45, described this evolution. My father started out watching them like hawks, convinced they might sabotage equipment or attack us. By harvest time, he was teaching them to drive the tractor and having them join us for lunch. He said to me, "They're just farm boys like ours, caught on the wrong side of a terrible war." It changed how our whole family understood the conflict. This humanizing effect represented an unintended but significant outcome of the program. At a time when wartime propaganda portrayed Germans as uniformly fanatical Nazis, the face-to-face encounters between rural Americans and German prisoners created space for more complex understandings. These personal connections did not negate the very real atrocities committed by the Nazi regime, but they did complicate the narrative of collective guilt that dominated wartime discourse. The POW labor program's legacy also includes physical artifacts that survive to the present day. Beyond the Algona nativity scene, several communities preserve prisoner-created artwork, buildings constructed by POW labor, or historical markers commemorating camp locations. These tangible remnants provide windows into a largely forgotten chapter of American homefront history. At Fort Robinson, Nebraska, a museum displays furniture crafted by German prisoners. In Tule Lake, California, an irrigation system built by POWs still waters agricultural fields. Outside Kansas City, a stone chapel constructed by Italian and German prisoners stands as a reminder of how captives transformed their confinement into creative expression. These physical legacies represent more than mere curiosities. They embody a complex historical moment when enemies lived and worked within American communities, when the exigencies of war created unexpected forms of cooperation, and when official enmity coexisted with human connection. The POW labor program's historical significance extends beyond its immediate economic impact to broader questions about how societies balance security concerns with humanitarian obligations, legal commitments, and practical necessities during wartime. The program demonstrated that adherence to international law regarding prisoner treatment could align with national self-interest, a lesson with continuing relevance for contemporary conflicts. As the last generation with direct memory of World War II passes, the stories of German POWs harvesting American crops while their comrades starved in Europe risk fading from historical memory. Yet the program's legacy endures in less visible ways, in the agricultural techniques transferred between nations, in the personal connections that transcended wartime divisions, and in the example of how pragmatic humanity can sometimes prevail, even amid global conflict. The contrast between Germany's hungry soldiers and America's well-fed POWs ultimately reflected divergent national approaches to fundamental questions. How do societies secure their basic needs? What obligations do they recognize toward even their enemies? How do they balance ideological commitments with practical necessities? In the fields of Iowa and the forests of Germany, these abstract questions found concrete expression in the daily reality of soldiers' lives. Former POW Heinz Fussman, who returned to Washington State after the war to establish his own orchard, perhaps best summarized the program's complex legacy. In a 1985 oral history interview, he reflected, "It seems strange to say my time as a prisoner was fortunate, but compared to what happened to so many others, it was. I worked hard, I ate well, I learned new skills, and I was treated as a human being even though I was an enemy. This experience shaped everything that came after for me. It showed a different way of being in the world, even during war. That lesson was worth as much as all the apples I picked." As we look back on this remarkable historical episode, we can see it as more than a footnote to the larger narrative of World War II. The story of German POWs harvesting American crops while their compatriots went hungry in Europe illuminates fundamental contrasts between different approaches to war, agriculture, and human dignity. It reminds us that even amid history's darkest chapters, alternative paths remain possible, paths that recognize shared humanity and practical necessity even across enemy lines. In the Iowa cornfields and German battlefields of 1944, two visions of society confronted each other. One founded on conquest and racial hierarchy ultimately failed to provide even for its own soldiers. The other, despite its own imperfections and inconsistencies, maintained both agricultural abundance and basic humanitarian standards, even toward enemies. The contrast could not have been more stark, nor its lessons more enduring. Today, as new global tensions emerge and resource challenges loom, this historical contrast offers valuable perspective. It reminds us that how societies organize to meet basic human needs, food, shelter, dignity, ultimately shapes their resilience and sustainability, even in crisis. The farms where German prisoners once harvested American abundance stand as quiet monuments to this truth, their furrows holding memories of hunger and plenty, enmity and connection, war and its aftermath. In the end, the story of America's POW labor program and Germany's starving soldiers transcends its specific historical moment to touch on perennial questions about war, resources, and human treatment. It reveals how policies rooted in pragmatic humanity can yield benefits beyond their immediate goals, creating ripples that extend across decades and borders. And it reminds us that even in warfare's harsh landscape, spaces can emerge where enemies recognize each other's common humanity, a recognition that contains seeds of future reconciliation. Former Iowa farmer John Swenson, who employed German POWs in 1944-45, offered a fitting epitaph for the program when interviewed in his 90s. "We were at war, but we were still human beings dealing with other human beings. We needed help with the harvest. They needed decent treatment. Sometimes it's that simple. We didn't forget they were German soldiers, but we remembered they were men first." Maybe that's the only way forward after any war, remembering the human being behind the uniform. As the last witnesses to this remarkable chapter in history pass from the scene, their stories remain as testimony to unexpected connections forged across enemy lines, to practical solutions found amid global conflict, and to the enduring importance of maintaining humanity even in humanity's darkest hours. From the bread that crumbled in a German soldier's hands on the Eastern Front to the abundant harvests gathered by his captured comrades in America's heartland, this contrast illuminates not just a forgotten chapter of World War II, but timeless truths about war, peace, and the choices societies make in both.